Hey guys, my name is Anthony Wallace and this is Nara Makes Games Reviews. Today I want to do something a little different and I'd like to break down my current favorite handheld gaming consoles of all time. As you guys probably know, I've been pretty deep in the handheld gaming scene for about 4 years now. This all started back at the end of 2020 when I picked up a Game Boy Color in Japan and jumped headfirst into Game Boy modding. I grew up playing Nintendo consoles, but it was during the pandemic when I focused my life on all things retro gaming. I also had a love of retro game emulation, eventually resulting in my 2-year position as a news and reviews producer for Retro Dodo, one of the most popular retro gaming websites in the scene. In those 4 years, well over 100 handheld gaming devices have passed through my collection. So I'd like to officially catalog my current favorites to set a mark I can look back at in a couple of years to see how things change in both the handheld gaming scene as well as how things change in my own personal tastes. To that end, let's take a look at my current favorite handheld gaming consoles of all time. The best place to start would be with a device that truly solidified my love of handheld retro gaming and what I look for in a handheld gaming console. It will be no surprise to longtime followers of mine that my favorite retro gaming console is the Game Boy Pocket. To me, the Game Boy Pocket just has the absolute perfect form factor. It's compact, sleek, and stays out of your way, letting the games truly shine. And it makes for the perfect home to some of my favorite games of all time, with original Game Boy holding most of my favorite games to play when on a handheld console. I started diving deep into Game Boy modification at the beginning of 2021, and the Pocket quickly became my favorite console to play with. So I should say that after having modified over 50 Game Boy Pockets in my day, I do consider a modern IPS screen a requirement if I'm going to be putting any serious time into playing on the Pocket. It's very difficult to go back to a screen with no backlight once you've seen the light. The Game Boy Pocket is a device that holds so many fond memories for me, and it's also the device that set the bar for what I love in a gaming console. I'd also like to give an honorable mention to the Game Boy Color and the original Game Boy DMG, which both hold their own special attributes and both have had their time as my favorite to play original Game Boy games on. And as you can probably tell by now, it's those vertical format consoles that really grab my attention. Which leads me to what is still one of my favorite retro emulation devices of all time, the Anbernic RG351V. I purchased the RG351V shortly after its release back in early 2021, and it very quickly became my prized possession. I took my RG351V with me everywhere I went and put some very serious time on this vertical handheld device. To me, the Anbernic RG351V is flawless, with some caveats. For what it is, I would change literally nothing about the design. It's a thing of beauty with perfect ergonomics, a perfect fit for my hands, and the buttons are so buttery and perfect for someone coming from original Game Boys. That's a lot of uses of the word perfect. And the RG351V plays all of the game consoles I tend to focus on, which are those early retro consoles up to 64-bit. I do not typically find myself playing anything outside of the Game Boy and Super Nintendo. But when I do, it's usually some Mario Kart 64 or Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2, both of which play great on the RG351V. Now, I did say that this handheld is perfect with caveats, and what I mean by that is that while I do believe the design is flawless, I would have a few things I would change if I could design my dream handheld. For one, I would love it if the screen were a 4-inch square rather than the 3.5-inch 4x3 screen. I'd reduce the bezels, which are quite large by 2024 standards. This change would not increase the overall size of the device, so it would still be that perfect size and fit for my own tastes. And as some of you have probably heard me say many times online, I do wish that Anbernic produced the RG351V in a metal shell, like some of their other flagship devices from 2022 and 2023. So my dream device is basically the Anbernic RG351V with a larger Game Boy focused screen and a metal shell. If I had that, I could retire from that never-ending cycle of buying new devices in search of the perfect handheld. But wish lists aside, I do think that the RG351V is still one of the absolute best emulation devices to ever release, and it's still the bar to beat as my own personal favorite emulation console. Now, there have been many emulation devices that have come and gone, and many of them have held my attention for a short period of time, but there's usually something about them that just doesn't hold up to what I usually look for in a console, which is almost always going to be a vertical Game Boy-like experience. The only emulation device that has come pretty close to matching my love of the Anbernic RG351V would be the Miyoo Mini Plus. To me, the Miyoo Mini Plus is also theoretically perfect. A 10 out of 10 emulation device that has a perfect design. And again, I would change absolutely nothing about the Miyoo Mini Plus. The only reason I don't find myself reaching for it over something like the RG351V or the device coming up next on my list has to do with the size. The compact nature of the Miyoo Mini Plus is both its blessing and its curse for me. Yes, it is very pocket friendly, and it addresses one of my only complaints about the RG351V by doing away with the large screen bezels. But if I compare the feel in my hands between the two, I do prefer something just a bit larger to hold onto. That's also why I started to lean more towards something like the original Game Boy over the Game Boy Pocket for longer gameplay. I just want something a little more substantial to hold onto. And for that reason, the next device has quickly grown to be my number one go-to device when I want to play retro games on a handheld. My current favorite retro handheld is the Analog Pocket. Now, I don't think I will really have to explain why this is my current favorite, and I'm also guessing you can probably guess my only complaint about the device. The Analog Pocket is, without a doubt, the most beautiful gaming device ever created. This thing has some very serious visual appeal. And the screen of the Analog Pocket is for sure the most beautiful screen for retro video games, at 3.5 inches at a 10:9 proportion, being Game Boy focused. I never fully understood how screen sizes are measured, but the difference of a 3.5 inch at 4:3 and a 3.5 inch at 10:9 are quite drastic. And the screen of the Analog Pocket is perfectly right for playing retro games. Maybe it's because I'm getting older, but I need something just a bit larger than that familiar 3.5 inch screen that we have seen so many times in the emulation scene. And as I'm sure you've guessed, my only complaint about the Analog Pocket again are those large bezels. But having put probably hundreds of hours on both of my Analog Pockets over the past year or so, the bezel doesn't take away from the experience at all, and I rarely find myself thinking about it. It would just be the main thing I would change if I were able to design my own perfect handheld. And those tiny volume buttons. The lack of analog sticks on the Analog Pocket is also a plus for me, as I almost never play games that use them. And luckily, I've got a small army of handhelds that can play a wide variety of games and console eras. So if I want to play games that use analog sticks, I got that too. But 99% of the time, I'm playing Tetris DX, so the Analog Pocket is my current favorite handheld gaming device, maybe even replacing the Anbernic RG351V as my personal best of all time. And when I say best of all time, I mean the best emulation device of all time. And I make that distinction because if I'm declaring what I believe is the absolute best handheld gaming device of all time, I choose the Nintendo Switch. In a deserted island hypothetical situation, I would for sure pick the Nintendo Switch as the one and only device I'd bring with me. The creativity in the design of this hybrid, portable, and home console surely helped put it above any other handheld console to ever be created, in my opinion. The Nintendo Switch is insanely beautiful, and it's the home of some of the best video games ever created. Whether we're talking about current generation exclusive games, as well as plenty non-exclusives, or even the large collection of retro titles available through the Nintendo Switch online service. Clearly there's a lot of options. When I became a digital nomad back in 2018, the only device I took with me was the Nintendo Switch, and it was a blessing during the pandemic when there was seemingly infinite amounts of downtime. Last year, I picked up the Legend of Zelda OLED model of the Switch, and that instantly became my #1 console. Ever. This list of my favorite devices addresses the unique issue of favorites versus bests, which is a distinction I often make, and I do believe that best and favorites can sometimes be quite different. My favorite device in 2024 is the Analog Pocket, and the best handheld gaming device of 2024 is the Nintendo Switch by my measure. And my personal favorite of all time still might be the Anbernic RG351V. So as you can see, this topic can get a bit complicated. Luckily, I have been able to sort of narrow down my favorites to a few solid options, and I don't find myself picking up any and every new handheld that comes out. I would say that my personal collection nowadays is quite modest compared to some of my peers. As we pass the halfway point of 2024 with a few incredible devices already releasing this year and some intriguing things teased for the future, it will be very interesting to see how things change on my list in the next couple years. I do imagine that a few new vertical emulation devices will release that could potentially surpass the RG351V or the Analog Pocket as my personal favorite device to take out to coffee shops to play Tetris DX. But until then, you know what I'll be doing.